Okay, so for this lecture, we're going to kind of continue talking about in a little more detail some of the things we mentioned in the last lecture in terms of how do we measure intelligence. So we'll talk a little bit about Terman as well as Thurstone, as well as Gardner and a few others, kind of more in the modern theories of intelligence. So we're going to look at something as well called general factors of intelligence, as well as kind of principal mental abilities, which is kind of where the two primary competing schools of measuring intelligence kind of ended up, and where we're kind of at today.
So the question really is kind of what is intelligence, right? Can you define it? And how would one define what is considered intelligence versus non-intelligence? And is it one thing? Is there one kind of numbers, one quantifiable factor that we can boil down all of human intelligence to? Or does it consist of several abilities, right? And can we use new technologies like CAT scans, MRIs, amino acid testing, things like that? Can we use these kind of new biochemical pieces of science to try and figure out a way to measure intelligence directly? There are several kind of direct measures in terms of intelligence today that are kind of still used. We have brain volume correlates kind of moderately at a 0.44 with intelligence, but head size does not, right? So volume can correlate a little bit with intelligence, but the actual size of the head does not. Glucose consumption may correlate negatively, right? So the less glucose your brain is consuming, the kind of less intelligent you are, the kind of less of an ability you'll have on cognitive tasks. Speed at which one can perceive an image could be used as a kind of quantifiable measure of intelligence, as well as the speed at which the brain waves register a stimulus, right? But really, these aren't actual measures of intelligence, right? If we look at number one, brain volume, that's simply a correlation, noting that people who generally have a higher brain volume tend to do better on test scores. Glucose consumption, that's another correlation, right? It's and we all know from basic statistics that just because we have a correlation of two factors does not mean that one factor necessarily caused the other to occur. So if we look at some of the motivations for early intelligence testing, remember in schools, the first intelligence tests were developed in France to kind of enable public schools to measure children for proper grade placement. And the reason for this was, well, as kind of we were moving from this rural to urban kind of economy, or this kind of non-industrial to industrialized economy, we started to see that these kind of rural schools were at a disadvantage, right? Because they were primarily one-room schools with all ages being taught by a single teacher, right? So there's not any kind of difference, or there's not a whole lot of progression in terms of education, right? Schools in cities, on the other hand, were stratified by academic accomplishment, not by age, as is now done. So it's kind of interesting that when we look at kind of those early schools in France, they're stratified based on abilities, right? Based on how well or how far you've achieved in your studies, rather than age. So children moving to large cities needed to essentially be placed within this kind of stratified academic system. So they needed this intelligence testing in order to kind of figure out where they were going to be placed in this public schooling system. So remember we talked a little bit about Paul Broca's notion of craniometry, which is measuring the body to understand its functions, including, more importantly, the head, right? So he equated essentially having a larger head with greater intelligence, and concluded that men were more intelligent than women because, on average, from his study, their heads were a little bit larger, right? And he concluded that the sex difference was greater in contemporary people than it must have been in the past, because remember, Broca was basically using a bunch of skeletons from ancient Europe. So his assumptions exemplified kind of the biases of the time, right, against women, the elderly, and primitive people, right? He believed differences in brain sizes supported those biases. So Broca even went so far as to kind of co-opt some of Darwin's kind of ideas here. He used the evolutionary theory to kind of support his thinking. He said, from his words, "I would rather be a transformed ape than a degenerate son of Adam," right? Remember we talked about the whole notion of degenerationism. So Broca believed that men struggle to survive, whereas women are kind of this protected class. So because men struggle with each other, they have more opportunity to acquire kind of traits that make their brain larger, right? So bigger brains are selected for men, but not for women, right? So Broca's work was cited to justify essentially denying education to women in France during the time. So some of the kind of criticisms, at least that Gould pointed out with Broca's work, was that brain weight, we know, decreases with age. So the women that were used in Broca's studies were actually a lot older than the men that were used. So naturally, their brains are going to be a little bit less weighty. They're going to have less weight to them. So taking kind of cause of death into account, Gould concluded that there's probably no difference in brain weight between men and women, right? A man of the same height would have the same size brain as a woman of that height, right? So the sample size for prehistoric brains as well is far too small, with 7 males and 6 female brains, right? So when we have these really small sample sizes, any type of statistical artifact is going to pop up, right? Because the sample size is really small and it's not representative of populations as a whole. I mean, even in your basic statistics class, they'll tell you that a sample size smaller than 20 doesn't have a whole lot of statistical significance behind it. So if we look at who made our first intelligence test, we talked about this a little bit last time with Alfred Binet in the early 1900s. And the reason he made it was a kind of a push for compulsory education in the French educational system and to help identify students for special educational purposes. What made Binet's work kind of extremely important is he was the first to kind of look at psychological scales or psychological factors for measuring intelligence, right? So this kind of supplanted earlier attempts to use physical measurements and subjective judgments as assessments for intelligence, right? So informal subjective assessments may be correct or wrong, but are prone to prejudice and cause trouble when people place excess confidence in them, right? So an important result of Binet's work was the replacement of these haphazard and prejudiced methods with a standard, uniform, and objective method of assessment, right? So he standardized the kind of measurement of intelligence rather than people relying on all these various researchers who had come up with their own methods and their own scales. So in terms of Binet's education, he didn't have a whole heck of a lot. He read Darwin, Galton, as well as John Stuart Mill. He was essentially a self-taught library psychologist, right? So this deprived him of kind of interaction with others and training in critical thinking. Binet eventually accepted a staff position at La Salpêtrière, working with Charcot as his mentor. And Charcot used circular reasoning, right? People who could be hypnotized had unstable nervous systems, right? As evidence of this, they could be hypnotized. So that's kind of that notion of circular reason, right? So Binet accepted Charcot's reasoning without question, right? And this is really what led to kind of Binet's failure to recognize that a standardized system for measuring intelligence simply isn't adequate. So Binet and another student of Charcot, which was a guy named Ferrer, claimed that hypnotic phenomenon could be transferred from one side of the body to the other using magnets, right? So they also reported polarization in which a red hallucination would turn green with the use of a magnet. They believed the magnetic field was responsible for this, right? So patients had full knowledge of what was expected, so the expectations were poorly controlled and carelessly conducted. Ultimately, they had to admit their errors, right? That hypnotizability was not necessarily linked to this fictitious disease called hysteria. So essentially what we're looking at here is a lot of what happens in a lot of psychological studies, right? They kind of made the subjects aware of the goal of the study before they kind of subjected them to it. So whether those participants realized it or not, they may have been unconsciously or consciously assisting those researchers in obtaining those goals, right? So unknowingly kind of injecting bias into the study itself. So if we look at Binet's research on cognition and kind of this notion of bias, he actually was really humiliated by those hypnotism studies and became kind of obsessively concerned with suggestibility in experiments, right? He became increasingly withdrawn and more shy. He was studying his own children. He published 3 papers describing their cognitive development. He devised a number of tests to kind of test their thinking, and these studies anticipated Paget's work, and Paget later worked with Binet's kind of collaborator, Simon, analyzing the wrong answers children gave on intelligence tests. But we don't really talk a whole lot about Paget in this class because it's kind of outside of the purview of really what we're talking about. But it's really an interesting study. So if you guys get a chance, take a look at Paget and look at those kind of negative intelligence studies. In 1882, there was a law in France that established a mandatory primary education for children from 6 to 14 years old. So a national system of exams had to be established to select students for secondary and university education as well as vocational schooling, right? So the competition was intense with 969 applicants to one opening at a university compared to 290 to one in the U.S. at the time. The concern about kind of mentally handicapped, or what was termed at the time retarded children, retarded in the sense of their development is stunted. In the schools, children unable to kind of learn, motivated interest in a systemic way or a systematic way of kind of identifying them. So when we look at Binet and Simon's work regarding kind of the children's education system in France, they developed 20 subtests and investigated a variety of other measures and relationships between them. They concluded that craniometry, kind of Broca's earlier work, had little value. The tests included things like association tests, sentence completion, themes on a given topic, picture descriptions and memory tests, object drawing and descriptions, digit repetition and other memory and attention tests, as well as tests of moral judgment, right? They carefully specified controlled testing conditions for each student. So Binet and Simon kind of administered their test to a large number of school children and a small number of quote-unquote mentally handicapped children to develop kind of norms, right? In 1908, they developed a revised scale consisting of 14 of the original tests, 7 of which had been modified, and 33 new tests, right? So the tests were arranged according to age levels from 3 to 13. The average 5-year-old should score at a mental level of 5, right? If a majority, 75 to 90%, passed a test, it was assigned to that age level. So essentially, if 95% of 5-year-olds passed this test they thought would be adequate for 5-year-olds, then it was considered a good test. So Binet and Simon rejected kind of the concept of a mental age, right? They didn't think that there was such a thing as a static mental age at which people kind of rested at, right? They believed that everyone was kind of capable of change, whether to some degree or another. So moving on from the kind of Simon-Binet scale, once the kind of test or the IQ test, the intelligence quotient test, reached America, there was a gentleman named kind of Louis Terman that kind of took over it and really kind of made that kind of the test that was given to school children in the United States, right? So we now call it kind of the Stanford-Binet IQ test because Louis Terman was working at Stanford at the time, and they kind of revised Binet's whole scale. So they really kind of cemented this idea of an intelligence quotient, right? This whole notion of mental age divided by chronological age times 100, right? Which gives you your, quote, IQ, right? Which is supposedly your quantifiable, measurable way in which to determine somebody's intelligence. So they believed that that even retarded children or kind of mentally handicapped children could raise their mental levels and devised a system for training for the mentally handicapped, much like our Montessori schools that we have today. Louis Stern introduced the concept of mental quotient as a ratio of chronological age to mental age, right? So really, Binet and Simon were really more concerned about educational help, right? They were really more concerned about kind of determining ability in order to develop better educational systems. They had no interest in ranking students. They had no interest in ranking intelligence. They actually rejected this notion of mental age. They rejected the notion or opposed the concept of IQ, right? It wasn't until we get to Terman and Louis Stern that in kind of the American version of IQ testing that we really get to the notion that IQ directly corresponds to intelligence. The Binet-Simon scale, once it was kind of solidified and kind of codified in France, kind of started to move around to different governments throughout Europe. And this was mainly because it was easy to administer and very brief, so it was kind of quickly adapted for wide use. By World War I in 1914, the tests were being used in a dozen different countries, often simply translated without any attempt to standardize them for the new kind of cultural or environmental setting. By the end of World War I, 1.7 million inductees to the U.S. Army had been tested, right, for Terman. And Terman had revised the scale for use in the U.S., and 4 million children were subsequently tested after the scale was revised. So if we look at Lewis Terman in a little more detail here, we know that he developed IQ tests for World War I for Army recruits and promoted their use. The tests were determined access to officer training. So we know that kind of based on this kind of how skewed these tests were, they were being very selective in terms of, the cultural, ethnic, and racial background of their officers, essentially. So the IQ test kind of acted as a good cover for kind of reinstilling or kind of reinforcing that prejudice within the Army. So essentially, Terman's test concluded that native Southern Europeans, Middle Easterners, and Asians were intellectually inferior and therefore not really suited to become officers in the Army, right? And where did he kind of get a lot of this information from, or where did he kind of get a lot of this kind of ideology from? Well, he belonged to something called the Human Betterment Foundation, which was a eugenics group, right? So we've kind of talked about how popularized eugenics became throughout the semester, how it's kind of moved its way through different sectors of society, right? And now we're seeing how it's kind of met with government policy, right? How they're starting to use these kind of ideological tests and things that were developed or kind of altered by Terman and as well as others in America. They're using them as a way to kind of bolster or kind of support this whole eugenics ideology, this whole eugenics movement, right? So if we look at one other individual we've talked a little bit about before as well, a guy named Henry H. Goddard, or H.H. Goddard. He's another kind of person who popularized IQ tests in the United States. So in 1984, as a matter of fact, the editors of Science named the development of the IQ test is one of the 20 most significant discoveries in science, technology, and medicine of the 20th century. And think about what that means. We've talked about it, last lecture and so far in this lecture, how skewed these tests are and how there's really no quantifiable way to really figure out, intelligence or relative intelligence, right? So for us to kind of sit there and label the IQ test, or kind of how, and we know how kind of racist and terrible, or how kind of bigoted the history of the IQ test once it got to America is, kind of almost makes you balk at the notion that we would think this was one of the most significant discoveries in science, right? So Henry Goddard, H.H. Goddard, and Lewis Terman were the two men primarily responsible for introducing this IQ test to America. Goddard himself earned a doctorate at Clark University and then was appointed as research director of a New Jersey home for 230 of what he called feeble-minded children. So while there, Goddard became convinced of the need for a way to distinguish between normal versus feeble-minded children and a reliable way to identify levels, right? So he was given a copy of kind of the Binet-Simon test in Europe, and he translated that scale into English with some minor changes, such as names of coins and things like that, to kind of make it more culturally appropriate for the United States. He administered the test to 400 children at Vineland and 2,000 children within the New Jersey public school system. The scores at Vineland agreed with their records, right? So the scores of the public school systems varied quite widely, right? So last time we talked a little bit about the Kallikaks when we talked about H.H. Goddard here, and the gentleman who kind of went and reviewed Mendel's work was a guy named Hothersall. You don't really need to know his name, but he reviews Mendel's work and to put the study of kind of this Kallikak family into perspective. And we know, based on kind of your high school biology, that Mendel was the first to do systematic experiments studying genetics and, more importantly, the heritability of characteristics, right? And he started it with mice, then bees, and then, of course, moved on to pea plants, which we're all kind of familiar. And his work really work to establish the valid principles inheritance, right? So kind of piggybacking off of Mendel's work, this is when he started to really get this idea, well, intelligence must be one of those inheritable traits. So just real quick going over Mendel's findings for those of you who are unfamiliar. First, he bred tall and short pea plants. The resulting hybrids were all tall. Then he bred hybrids with each other. Most were tall, a minority were short. And he guessed that height was controlled by two genes, one from each parent. The tall height gene was dominant and the short height gene was recessive, right? So his ideas really did not catch on, and his papers were essentially burned. It wasn't until much, much later that kind of Mendel's work became kind of one of the foundations of modern biological science. So you might be asking yourself, where is the connection between Gregor Mendel and H. Goddard, or this notion of heritability and intelligence in the United States? Well, Mendel, remember, he was kind of not very widely read at his time, and a lot of his papers were burned because the church kind of viewed them as anti-religious. I remember that Gregor Mendel was a monk. But he was rescued from obscurity by a few people, right? We have William Bateson, who published the Mendel's Principles of Heredity, a defense in 1902. We also have a Dutch botanist, Hugh de Vries, who also described Mendel's work. And Goddard actually read a copy of de Vries' report, and that's when he applied it to intelligence, right, which is a major leap, which was influenced by Goddard or Galton's reports on hereditary genius, right? So really what Goddard was doing was he was looking at these kind of current reports in science, right? This kind of rehashing of Mendel's work by de Vries on the heritability of physical traits, as well as looking at Galton's work on the kind of hereditarian nature of genius, right? So he kind of, those were his two major sources of influence in terms of developing this notion of intelligence testing in the United States, right? So Goddard discovered that many of the siblings of the inmates of his institution had themselves been evaluated as feeble-minded as well. So that kind of really, according to his scale, and that's what really kind of cemented his notion that intelligence was distinctly heritable. So Goddard took those influences that he received from Mendel's work, as well as some of the kind of early work with Binet and the intelligence testing, and he used this Kallikak family as kind of his case study. Deborah Kallikak, who was an individual that he traced her mental age or traced her ancestry back to the American Revolution, and she had a mental age of 9 at the age of 22, right? So Deborah was supposedly descended from an illegitimate liaison with a feeble-minded barmaid, starting the bad side of the family tree, right, full of quote-unquote riffraff, right? Later, Martin married a good Quaker woman and founded the good side of the family tree, which was found to have little feeble-mindedness. So he concluded that feeble-mindedness is genetic, and more importantly, that morality is genetic, right? And that morality is heritable, right? And that if you do not mate, or you mate with someone who is feeble-minded, your children not only are going to be subjected to that feeble-mindedness, they are also going to be subjected to questionable morals as well. So in essence, a few criticisms of Goddard's study of the Kallikaks, as well as his work with the feeble-minded children's home. The study itself took 2 years, which seems a little short. It was conducted by untrained staff, perhaps biased within his institution. There was little objective testing of the relatives, reliance on reports by family and associates, and positions in society used to infer intelligence. And think about what that means, right? They're taking their socioeconomic status and already inferring what the intelligence is before any testing is even done. So essentially, criminal behavior and feeble-mindedness were then equated with one another, right? So there's an assumption of a single gene for IQ, which is what Goddard was kind of basing all of his research off of, is simply implausible, right? We know that intelligence and the development of neurological structures in many instances is pleiotropic, right? Many, many genes are involved in controlling those structures. So one of the things that Gould points out that kind of really, kind of more the insidious nature of Goddard's study, was that Goddard tampered with the photos to make them appear less normal when he was showing the kind of relatives of Deborah Kallikak, right? Where on the other hand, Deborah, who is one of the members of his Home of the Feeble-Mindedness, he made her photos look nice and prim and proper, so to kind of show the difference between how effective his systems are at kind of combating this notion of feeble-mindedness, right? He believed that feeble-minded looked normal, so he would have been less likely to kind of modify them, undercutting Gould's claim, right? So there's really a little bit of debate here, but when you look at these photos up close, and in the last lecture I have a couple up close photos of them, you can clearly see that they've been altered in some particular way, particularly around the eyebrow and the eye area. So these kind of studies of these kind of rural families throughout the United States kind of started to expound, right? We had similar studies of the Jukes, the Hill folk, the Nams, the Ishmaelites, and the Zeros reportedly showed reproduction rates twice those of normal families, right? So Goddard spoke about practical methods for eliminating defective people from the U.S. population, right? So we had mainstream psychologists like Yerkes, Thorndike, Cannon, and Terman all supporting this notion of eugenics via sterilization, right? So U.S. involuntary sterilization laws were upheld by the courts and stayed in place until the 1960s, right? In some places, kind of being done in secret all the way up until the 1980s. So really, this is what happened. You know, Goddard essentially created this Kallikak study, and then subsequent studies really showed, according to the scientists that did them, that there was this horrible need to stamp down or kind of prevent these feeble-minded people from reproducing because they reproduce twice as fast, right? So in essence, what we're really looking at here is essentially a warfare or intellectual warfare on the poor. People, you know, in all of these studies, if you look at the common thread is that people who are feeble-minded are also people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic status. So in essence, what he's really doing here is kind of creating a scientific justification, not only for poverty, but also scientific justification for sterilizing people who are poor to prevent them from kind of perpetuating these cycles of poverty. So if we look at Goddard's study at Ellis Island, right, in 1910, 1/3 of the U.S. population was foreign-born, raising fears that the U.S. was being swamped by these foreign-born invaders. So Teddy Roosevelt was appointed a commission to study this. More recent immigrants were coming from the East and Southern Europe, and it was feared that immigrants would be an impetus for the development of unions, right, to keep them out, which would threaten the U.S. economic system, right? So new immigrants were Catholic and not Protestant, which was the kind of primary religious affiliation for politicians in the U.S. at the time, right? It was claimed that many immigrants were mentally defective, and 2% were denied entry and sent back. So kind of once Goddard got into Ellis Island and implemented his kind of intelligence testing, he began using those psychological methods, and the number of feeble-minded people increased dramatically from 350% in 1913 to 570% in 1940. This is just showing you just the massive increase of who was being labeled as feeble-minded, right? Goddard claimed that 83% of Jews, 80% of Hungarians, 79% of Italians, as well as 87% of Russians were feeble-minded based on cultural biased testing, right? So in essence, what he was doing was taking these kind of cultural fears at the time of, in essence, the kind of westernized white European descendants that lived in the United States being overrun by these kind of Southern and Eastern European people, as well as people of Jewish descent. This is why most of these groups were, quote, being labeled as feeble-minded. So essentially, the result of this was these restrictive immigration quotas that were enacted via. So coming from Goddard's work, or a speech Goddard gave before a group of Princeton undergraduates in 1919, he says, "Now the fact is that workmen may have a 10-year intelligence while you have a 20. To demand for him such a home as you enjoy is as absurd. How can there be a thing such as social equality with this wide range of mental capacity?" So this is what Goddard was really saying, right? You were poor, you had low socioeconomic status because you were less intelligent. And that is why. right? So there's no real need to work on social equality because, well, it wouldn't work because those people are simply not intelligent enough to grasp the mechanisms needed to wrest that social equality from your cultural system. So this is where Goddard's history comes a little bit closer to home for us. After kind of his work with the children who were mentally handicapped, in 1918, Goddard left Vinland for a position as the director of the Ohio State Bureau of Juvenile Research and then became a professor at Ohio State University. Goddard was hired as a consulting psychologist to help establish classes for gifted children, right? Those who had IQs that were above 120. So Goddard advanced or advocated enrichment, not rapid promotion, and the program produced long-lasting, quote, positive results, right, according to kind of Goddard's own writings. So switching gears here to talk a little bit about another contemporary of H.H. Goddard, we have Lewis M. Terman. Terman grew up on a farm in Indiana and then was sent to Central Norman College in Danville to become a teacher. He earned an M.A. from the University of Indiana. He's a former student of G.S. Hall, who helped him obtain a fellowship to Clark University to work with him. And Hall disapproved of mental tests, so Terman switched to the Edmund Sanford to direct his kind of thesis, right? So in essence, what we're seeing here is kind of that reversal of kind of the moving from working with Hall to working with Sanford because he wanted to work with testing intelligence. So after becoming a high school principal in San Bernardino, he taught at CSULA, which was formerly LA Normal School, and then he joined Stanford University. So it wasn't until Terman got to Stanford that he began to look at Binet's work and start to revise Binet's intelligence testing. So he revised that Binet-Simon scale into kind of the Stanford-Binet scale, which is what was used today, as described in this paper, The Measurement of Intelligence. He used a large standardized sample, 2,300, including 1,700 children, 200, quote, defective and superior 200 defective adults and 400 superior adults. His goal was to make the median chronological and mental ages coincide, right, to prevent IQs from changing across different ages with an average of 100, right? So this became the standard measure for intelligence with a standardized sample in 1916 of 10,000 people. So Terman moved on from that to study genius. So in 1921, Terman began an ambitious kind of longitudinal study of children who were with exceptionally high IQs of 140 plus, right? The study was continued after his death, and those participating in the study were called termites. His findings contradict the stereotype of geniuses as sickly weaklings interested in nothing but books, early ripe, early rot kind of notion. And he said the exceptional performance of these kind of exceptional children continued into their adult careers as well. If we look at another, we have Robert M. Yerkes, or Robert Mearns Yerkes, who is also a contemporary of Goddard as well as Terman. And he worked his way through college, then worked with Münsterberg for this doctorate in comparative psychology, publishing in the kind of culmination of his research in a paper called The Great Apes. He was offered a job and remained at Harvard for his entire career, and he replaced photos of James, Royce, and Palmer with pictures of great apes, his, quote, philosophers. So he also worked at Boston State's Psychopathic Hospital, which focused him on the need for better ways of measuring mental abilities. So if we look at kind of Yerkes testing in the Army, we have at the start of World War I, Yerkes organized a meeting to figure out how psychologists might aid the war. So he traveled to Canada to study their kind of war experiences. They decided to focus on adapting mental measurement to military needs, in essence, IQ testing in the Army. So 40 psychologists prepared tests for the Army to identify mentally incompetent, classify men by mental ability, and select individual for special training and extra responsibilities, right? So he was working alongside with kind of other individuals or other psychologists at the time. So in essence, the kind of Yerkes test was done by group administration, and it was meant for measuring native wit, not a level of education. It was steeply graded in difficulty, hard enough to tax those with high ability, but easy enough for those of lesser ability. It could not take more than an hour and be simple to score objectively, right? So he came up with the alpha test for those who were literate and the beta test for those illiterate or non-English speaking individuals. So if we look at the results of kind of Yerkes Army testing, we have only a minute percentage of inductees were discharged due to low test scores. In a 900-page report, he concluded that the average mental age was 13 years, which was much lower than assumed. This was then kind of co-opted for racist, anti-democratic conclusions. Goddard went so far as to propose that a meritocracy based on IQ should be used to replace our own American democracy. And a researcher named Brigham went so far as to blame the non-Nordic immigrants for the low IQ scores. And that study was later used by Congress as scientific, kind of along with H.H. Goddard's work, as kind of scientific justification for establishing quotas for immigration. But we do have some dissenting voices at the time of this kind of heyday of intelligence testing. In a publication called The New Republic, a author named Lippmann lambasted Terman, Goddard, and Yerkes, criticizing the assumption that IQ tests measure intelligence and that the mental age is 13, right? He stressed differences in early environment and experiences, making comparisons across class and race meaningless, right? So logically, it's impossible for the intelligence of an adult to equal that of a child. Labeling of kids is contemptible, right? So in essence, we did have some voices that were kind of, essentially speaking the voice of reason at the time. It just, wasn't really being paid attention to because a lot of the people in power at the time really wanted this testing, really wanted this research to show that the kind of decisions they were making regarding kind of racist ideology as well as eugenics as well as immigration were all justified. So what we're really looking at here in these kind of pages in the Gould book is really the kind of rise of reification, right? And reification is this complex idea for when you treat something immaterial like happiness, fear, or evil as a material thing. An example would be a wedding ring or a wedding ring being a reification of a couple's love, right? So studies in intelligence are a reification of an amorphous collection of varying factors which may or may not be correlated with one another. So in essence, intelligence in and of itself is immaterial. So out of all of these early kind of intelligence testing done by Terman as well as Yerkes as well as Goddard, even kind of looking at the early Simon-Binet studies, what came out of all of this was this notion of factor analysis, right, which is using statistics to find clusters of related items. For intelligence, maybe you would look for a cluster of the, clusters of people who had the ability to learn calculus, with the ability to use big words, with the ability to explain how to set a pick in BB or basketball, or ability to memorize long strings of number, and the ability to solve logic puzzles, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're looking at is how all of these factors or these different kind of traits cluster together in populations. So the kind of early pioneer of this factor analysis was a guy named Charles Spearman, and his work concluded that all types of intelligence correlate with one another, and this really led to this notion of G, or what he called the general intelligence factors, right? And that G can be used as a singular number or a singular quantifiable measure of intelligence. So Spearman's work really led to a rather uncompromising figure in Cyril Burt and his kind of hereditarian synthesis, right? So Burt's kind of initial proof of innateness, as well as later arguments, kind of led to Burt's blindness and Burt's kind of political use of this notion of innateness as a way to kind of describe intelligence, right? So Cyril Burt himself was Spearman's successor. His life's work was fixated on the notion that intelligence is heritable. So Gould says in the book that Burt's conclusions were distorted, namely his 1909 proof that intelligence is innate, right? The 1909 study is logically flawed as well as statistical. So looking at Burt's 1909 study, he selected 43 boys from Oxford school systems. 30 of them were elementary school-age children, and 13 were upper-class boys from a preparatory school. He administered intelligence tests to all of them, and after the data was obtained, he had underqualified people rank the subjects in order of intelligence. Using the data, Burt looked for correlations among the categories and concluded that upper-class boys were more intelligent than boys of a lower class, right? And in essence, to measure the intelligence of the parents, Burt simply assumed it based on their professions and social standing, right? So really what Burt was doing was just creating a way to scientifically mirror and justify the social inequality of the time, right? In essence, what he's really saying is that, we can definitively prove that intelligence is innate based on kind of this grouping that I've selected from Oxford school systems, right? So the conditions kind of for Burt, which was really interesting, he discounted environmental factors for 4 reasons. He says that the poverty of the lower middle class boys cannot be severe enough to make a difference unless they were poor to the point of starvation. It shouldn't be a huge factor in their intellectual development. He used his intuition to assume that the educative influences of home and social life seem small. The character of the tests themselves is unrelated to environmental influence. And a retesting of a subjects 18 months later produced no significant readjustment of ranks, right? So these 4 reasons were why Burt said that the environment played no role, right? But as you can see, kind of based on this circular reasoning that, well, if you say the environment has no influence and turn around and use that same reason for the environment not considering the environment, no wonder you're kind of missing these factors. So kind of the point that Gould makes is that when you look at Burt's career overall, he actually did some really good science, but when it came to kind of jumping into the kind of mired morass that is, measuring humans and measuring human capabilities, you really start to see that a lot of those studies were kind of politically marred or politically biased. So Gould essentially praises Burt on the amount of caution he took when investigating topics other than intelligence, right? For example, Burt did a study on left-handedness, which he regarded as a motor disability. As opposed to being right-handed. His study of wide range of information, including Renaissance paintings, for the frequency of right-handedness. In the end, he gave up and simply stated that there were just too many environmental factors to consider, right? Gould comments on the conclusion by noting that left-handedness is probably more likely to be a heritable trait than intelligence, right? So yet Burt managed to conduct an unbiased experiment. So in essence, if we kind of look at how Burt's work and Spearman's theory kind of coincide with one another, Spearman's 2-factor theory, the G and the S, were created to study and generalize human societal relationships, right? Cyril Burt wished to use this theory of his predecessor's work to rank and sort pupils because they had to be guided towards professions by identifying strengths and weaknesses in more specific areas, right? So thus, Burt created the 4-factor theory, right? The first factor being G, which is the first component of correlation found in mental testing. The second being group factors, which are subordinate to G but above S. S being attributes of a single trait measured on all occasions. And then the final factor being accidental factors, which are attributes of a single trait measured on one single occasion. So Burt, in essence, was a strong believer in reification and often thought of how things should be reified rather than on whether or not they should be, right? So Spearman correlated the G to cerebral energy, but Burt identified it to be the cerebral cortex, right? Gould argues that Burt's arguments lack concrete evidence and that there were sporadic, perfunctory, and peripheral. Burt used the correlation in many of his arguments verbatim and failed to cite sources or provide any specific reason for relating the G with cortical properties. Spearman tried to find a physical location in the brain for factors extracted from mental testing, but Burt was not satisfied with that. In essence, he wanted to say definitively that factors exist in the human body, right? Over his long career, Burt related emotional and polarity traits to the body as well. So Burt felt that every person should know what beauty was when he saw it, right? He bought birthday cards that ranged from his taste of elegant to ugly, and asked pupils to rank cards based on beauty. When the results did not come out as he had expected, Burt showed that he had had a higher reality where the only beauty was the beauty that he saw, in essence. So what we're saying here is that Burt was saying that, well, since they didn't rank those cards in terms of beauty the way he ranked them, then they obviously don't know what beauty is, and he must exist on a higher plane of existence than those other people. So if we look at kind of Burt and the political uses of this notion of general intelligence, right, Burt felt strongly on using G as a determinant of deserved education. So he was interested in comparing and sorting through different intelligences, right? So Burt saw that a person's general intelligence is almost entirely unchangeable, right? And he wanted to sort and rank pupils, right? He wrote reports for a test called 11 Plus, which was administered to 10 to 11-year-olds. Those who passed proved themselves worthy of higher education, but those who didn't were worthy of skills training, right? So Burt claimed that 11 Plus was liberal because it allowed special needs children the same chance to prove themselves worthy as the regular children, right? So as a result of 11 Plus, 80% of pupils were branded unfit for intelligence. Those unworthy were sent to technical schools to be trained as skilled. So if we look at another individual who is conducting intelligence testing at the time, we have L.L. Thurstone from 1938. And he says that intelligences need to be a measure of all 7 abilities, not just one factor, right? So he was a little bit different than what Spearman and some of the others were saying. He wanted to consider abilities such as verbal comprehension, numerical ability, spatial relations, perceptual speed, word fluency, memory, as well as inductive reasoning should all be considered in terms of measuring intelligence. So in essence, what Thurstone was doing was critiquing and reconstructing the egalitarian interpretation of these things called principal mental abilities, right? So Thurstone argued that Spearman and Burt's theories lose meaning graphically because they account for negative factoring, right? Thurstone believed that there was no negative factoring, only zero factoring, right? So negative factors imply factors that have a detrimental effect on human development, right? This is wrong because factors can have a positive effect or no effect at all, according to Thurstone. So vector graphs would work a lot better because they can be readjusted and rotated to value in every factor equally, right? So called a simple structure because no information would be lost, only essentially redistributed within the graphical system. So he defined these as kind of these PMAs, or these primary mental abilities, the abilities that every person has. They don't change positions despite the amount of tests taken or types of tests taken. Thurstone came up with at least 7, V for verbal comprehension, W for word fluency, N for computational, S for spatial, M for associate memory, P for perceptual speed, and R for reasoning, right? So he eliminated G because PMAs were traits that had no hierarchy or a dominant general factor. So Spearman had originally incorporated his critics into his system. Thurstone was kind of a different story. The G could vary from test to test, but Spearman maintained that it pointed to the same general direction. Thurstone argued that PMAs were at fixed positions, and Spearman and Burt's factors weren't real because they weren't fixed, right? Because in kind of Thurstone's statistical argument, the only real things that existed in kind of statistical validity are fixed positions. So Thurstone's primary mental abilities, or his PMAs, could be created by constructing a series of redundant tests that would establish vectors close to each other. Therefore, PMAs were also artifacts of chosen tests, not invariant vectors of mind, right? So really, there's no difference between what Spearman's doing, what Burt's doing, what Thurstone's doing, what Terman's doing. There's no difference, right? They're essentially creating tests and measuring intelligence, right? And the intelligence, or the kind of those measures, are vary widely based on how they construct these tests, right? So according to kind of Thurstone, PMAs could actually be test dependent since factor axes could increase infinitely with more tests, right? So Burt's group factors were discharged or disparaged by Thurstone, saying that negative abilities cannot exist, right? So in the end, the underlying issue was not solved, only used a different system of underlying assumptions in mathematics for the same data, right? So that's what we're doing here, essentially. All of these intelligence tests and all of these researchers that are testing intelligence or looking to measure intelligence are literally just starting with a base of assumptions and using math for a way in order to kind of prove or bolster those assumptions. So Thurstone came up with a way to kind of geometrically represent each of these kind of axes and data that were perpendicular to each other. He called them oblique axes, right? This implied that his axes were not correlated with one another. He wished to place the axes as close as possible to clusters of vectors, yet with perpendicular axes, there was no way to kind of achieve this, right? A possible reason he wanted there to be no correlation to identify PMAs, right? But correlated axes can be placed closer to clusters, right? So therefore, Thurstone invented rotated axes in simple structure. He then started kind of using oblique simple structures, right? But wait, if the axes themselves are correlated, wouldn't there be another general factor, right? So what we're seeing here is kind of when we look at the nitty and gritty, and I know this is kind of hard to understand if you haven't taken vector analysis and statistics, but what we're looking at here is, you know, how these researchers are using these high-leveled or high-powered statistical tests to apply them to sets of data and manipulate them in order to get the desired outcome or the desired results. So we're seeing kind of, I guess, the biggest culmination of what we've been talking about throughout the entire semester. First, we started using kind of these notions of physical measurements in order to kind of prove notions of race and intelligence, and now we're moving on to these more sophisticated statistical, systems or statistical apparatus in order to kind of measure intelligence as well, right? So in essence, Thurstone discovered second order G, a way of saying that correlation coefficients between mental tests are positive. However, Thurstone and the factorists retained their kind of distance, right? Spearman and Burt believed G must dominate, considering group factor secondary. Thurstone was the complete opposite. So Thurstone and Spearman and Burt had different tastes regarding their kind of interpretations. Burt and Spearman based their interpretations on the fact that G was real, but wait, there was a logical flaw, right? Reification of factors. So in the end, positive correlation comes from conditions during childhood, right? So if we look at how Thurstone used factor analysis, right? Factor analysis is used with crude data when there are no firmly established principles, right? So according to Thurstone, using factor analysis, a primary method implies a deep ignorance of principles and causes, right? So their desperate attempts to find correlations among things were the factorist only method of kind of searching, right? So factor analysis is useful when experimentations are kind of hard to conceive in other areas of science. So moving into kind of the epilogue, looking at kind of Arthur Jensen and Spearman's G. Arthur Jensen is kind of America's best known hereditarian, according to Gould, and wrote an 800-page treatise, essentially, defending G as a substantial and infallible measure of intelligence. He goes on to define intelligence as the G factor of a large battery of various mental tests, right? So Jensen goes on, he shows that G correlates quite readily with famous scales of IQ for a large age range, adding supposed credibility to his argument, right? Noting the ubiquity of G, Jensen proposes ranking all living organisms from the simplest of single-celled organisms to complex extraterrestrial life, right? Gould obviously despises this idea as it implies the linearity of progress within intelligence as the main criterion, rather than the outward expansion of evolution into different species, which are attuned for different environments and lifestyles, right? So really what we're seeing here is the modern reification, or the modern return of the great chain of being, right? We literally have Arthur Jensen from the 1960s onward saying you can rank all of life on the planet using this general factor of G, or this general intelligence factor. So in essence, what we're really seeing is the great chain of being just being rehashed in a new way, right? And we know all of the kind of, we've talked all semester about the kind of social and political implications that such a system has, right? That where you're able to rank things, then you can put one group on top of another and give that group better resources, better access, and better lives, right? So according to Gould, Jensen attempts to hide his own mistakes in judgment by criticizing the way in which L.L. Thurstone goes about his factor analysis, namely how he discards G as a secondary factor, one that is less indicative of intelligence than Jensen had originally thought. So Gould closes by pointing out that G is, to his relief, still the main justification of hereditarian arguments for mean differences in IQ among populations, and that the fallacious G simply nullifies these arguments, right? Because it's based off of that simple logical fallacy, right? That there really is no determinable, simple, general factor that exists between all human groups, right? If we look at some other kind of later controversies that occur, we have Cyril Burt's twin studies, in which he may have actually faked his data. There's no way to really know for certain, but Burt's findings have been replicated by other researchers. So in essence, there is something there in terms of the twin studies and how intelligence works between the two of them. But as Stephen Jay Gould points out, a twin study is kind of one of the greatest things you can actually have, because you can separate those twins, put them in two entirely different environments, and actually measure the progress intellectually. And if we were to essentially do that, Gould kind of hypothesizes that, of course, we would find what we all assume, that there'd be varying levels of intelligence based on environmental factors. So we also had debates over social bias, and testing arose in the 1940s and 1950s with essentially the working class versus the upper class. We also have debates over racial bias arose in the 1960s with Arthur Jensen's claim that IQ cannot be raised, right? That there's a kind of upper limit to what your abilities are. And then, of course, we have the bell curve with Herrnstein and Murray in 1994 reignited the debates about racial differences regarding educational abilities. So if we look at some of the current trends that we have in measuring intelligence, of course, we have Earl Hunt, Robert Sternberg, and Howard Gardner have proposed cognitive approaches to studying the knowledge structures underlying intelligent behavior. Hunt developed the cognitive correlates approach, correlating response times with scores on cognitive tasks, right? So he gives you a cognitive task, how long does it take you to complete it? Sternberg proposed a cognitive components approach, decomposing performance on analogies into a series of cognitive processes. Gardner proposed what we call a theory of multiple intelligences based on a decomposition of factors contributing to performance, right? This recapitulates the debate between kind of Spearman and Thurstone over G, a single factor correlating performance across multiple tests versus specific skills, right? So there remain few alternatives to objective group-based administered standardized testing, and intelligence testing remains a controversial topic today. So to kind of conclude our notions of measuring intelligence, right? Measures of intelligence are determined by those constructing the tests, right? Whether you're looking at specific skills or general factors, or whether you're trying to look at a mental age versus a actual intelligence age. There is no quantifiable way to accurately measure this notion of innate intelligence. There is no such thing as innate intelligence. As humans, we are all born with the same basic capabilities. It's where environment and rearing plays a role that really starts to diverge people in terms of levels of intelligence, right? So humans are in essence born with all the same mental capabilities. It's environment and life history that play a larger role in the development of intelligence, right? So intelligence, of course, is best viewed from a relativistic perspective, right? Because how do we develop an intelligence test here in the United States in an English-speaking American culture, and then go and give that intelligence test to a San Bushman living in southern Central Africa, right? There's just no way that the abilities, skills, and the intelligence that those Americans have are on the same kind of wavelength as the skills, intelligence, and abilities that those San Bushmen have, because they are two entirely different life ways, right? Two entirely different life histories. I'm not saying that one group is effectively more intelligent than the other, or that one group is less intelligent. What I'm saying is that there are different modes of intelligence, right? That based on your kind of human group's response to the environment in which you grew up in, right? When you have a large standardized kind of nation-state society, you have better access to wider varieties of different degrees of intelligences. When you're in kind of a smaller society and you're not really traveling, you're not participating in larger nation states, you're really only concerned with kind of your survival and your kind of culture, then your levels of your kind of abilities of intelligence are going to be different, and what's considered intelligent or what's considered, intellectual ability is going to be different, right? I go back to the original example I always like to use, right? I can write a journal article and have it published in an academic journal, which is considered a form of intellectual pursuit, whereas I cannot take apart the motor for my car. My mechanic, on the other hand, can't write an academic paper for a journal article, but can take apart my car motor and put it back together blindfolded. So there's different levels of intelligence, right? Intelligence is relative, right? There is no definitive measure of intelligence, regardless of what human group you're looking at, regardless of what culture you're looking at.